Swedes often think that they have, in some ways, more in common with the US than they realize. They think that the system in the US is just really similar, and that Social Democrats are just like Democrats, and that Republicans are just like the moderates, and that's not the case at all. So that's one of the things there, that there's that sort of simplistic view. Another difference is that sometimes people in Sweden don't always realize the role that cultural conservatism plays in people's viewpoints and religion, and on both sides, that is a factor as well.
You touch on the subject as well, that Swedes tend to make politics very much black and white, simplistic, but more complex than the US politics. Since you live in Sweden, how do you view the way you handle complexity in American politics?
Well, I would say this too. I don't want to make it sound like only Swedes are simplistic, because Americans are also very simplistic. The ones that know anything about Sweden also have a very simplistic idea of what Sweden is like. So the American view tends to be that this is just, everyone is a socialist. I've gotten questions when I've been back in the US, this must be strange for you handling money again, isn't it a socialist system and you hardly have any money? I mean, there's this very funny idea sometimes about what Sweden is. So that stereotype goes both ways, I think, for both countries. Just wanted to add that in. So.
Well, basically you could say that Sweden is in many ways past the ideological debate. We have most parties have accepted folkhemmet, the welfare state. Now it's all about how should we take care of that welfare state. In the US, on the other hand, you have a lively ideological debate about what kind of role should government have, if any role outside security and foreign policy.
But we're importing the methods, but we're not importing very much about the cultural politics. For example, when we go see the conventions in the US, it's very much about the motions and so on.
Yeah, but we are going that direction in a bit. It's more concentrated on the party leaders right now than it was, before.
This is a US-Sweden Intercultural Forum. Can you say something that you brought with you back from the US while living there when it comes to culture?
One thing that I noted, that people are actually, in many cases, much more friendly in America than in Sweden. We don't even say hi in the elevator, and that's just where it begins in Sweden. We don't help strangers in the way that you actually see people doing all the time in America. So what you might see just superficial when you see people pretend to be friendly in America, it's more than that. It is actually a different way to interact with people. And
but at the same time, we were discussing party politics and how the parties in the US are like big tents containing very much, and here it's more fragmented in several parties.
Yeah, no, that's true. In some ways, though, I see a movement towards the big tent model here. We obviously have seen this in the previous elections, where we had the alliance on one side and the red-green on the other, and even if these things aren't going to have the same composition that they had before, I still see the movement where a lot of the parties here are doing a lot more coalition work, where people talk about the election now sometimes as if there were only two parties, as if it was Social Democrats versus moderates. And that's a movement in that direction if you're going to talk about as if those were the only two, you know. And the other thing we see is, with the exception of the Sverigedemokraterna, a lot of the smaller parties are really struggling for survival here. So that's another, thing where I see it moving to that same thing we have in the US of that sort of big tent of a two-party system. It's a little bold to say that Sweden's going to a two-party system, but there's a movement towards that direction where you're seeing that kind of thing, which has its benefits but also its disadvantages.
Take the last presidential elections. There were about 500 Swedish political consultants, politicians, political journalists in the US to follow, especially the Obama campaign. And what they were looking on was not actually the issues, but the way of making politics, which is much easier in the US than in Sweden. This with targeting special groups, having, knowing to whom you should go when you're canvassing and knowing things about them. We are maybe surprisingly more restrictive on listing people in Sweden by law than in the US. But we are trying to use this sort of methods, more of micro-targeting, and we have all the way imported American methods to Sweden. But the issues are different.